On a chilly Thanksgiving morning, a young girl with nothing but hope in her heart invites a homeless man to her humble table. But what happens next will leave you speechless. A shocking twist of fate, secrets revealed, and a community transformed. Who is this mysterious stranger, and how does he change their lives forever? Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The cold crept in like an unwelcome guest, biting at every exposed surface in Layla Green's tiny Southside apartment. She shivered as she opened her eyes, the faint light of early morning casting long shadows across the room. The thin blanket she clutched did little to fend off the chill. She sat up slowly, her gaze drifting to the small frame photo on the nightstand, a snapshot of a smiling man with kind eyes. Her father. Kindness costs nothing, Layla, he used to say, his voice still echoing in her memory. It was his mantra, his legacy. Every time life felt overwhelming, she clung to those words like a lifeline. The sound of a coughing fit from the next room jolted her out of her thoughts. "Mama?" she called, her voice laced with worry. "I'm fine, baby," Miriam Green rasped, though the strain in her voice betrayed her. "Don't worry about me." Layla slipped out of bed and padded into the kitchen. The air was colder here, the draft from the window seeping through the poorly sealed frame. She found her mother leaning over the counter, one hand clutching her chest. "You're not fine," Layla said softly, placing a steadying hand on Miriam's arm. "You need to rest." Miriam gave her a weak smile. "I can't. It's Thanksgiving. I need to, at least make something." Her gaze drifted toward the near-empty pantry. Layla's heart sank. She knew there wasn't much to work with. The shelves held a few cans of vegetables, a half loaf of bread, and some spices. Hardly enough for a proper meal. But Thanksgiving wasn't just about food. It was about love, family, and gratitude. "I'll take care of it," Layla said firmly, her small frame straightening with resolve. Miriam frowned. "Take care of what?" "I'll go to the church pantry," Layla replied. "Pastor Miller said they'd be giving out food this morning." "You don't have to," Miriam began, but Layla interrupted her gently. "Yes, I do. And I'll be fine." Before her mother could argue further, Layla grabbed her coat and scarf. As she passed the small closet in the corner of the kitchen, her eyes fell on her father's wooden cart. It had been his pride and joy, a sturdy, hand-built cart he used to carry groceries when they still had a car. Now it was a relic of better days. She pulled it out carefully, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "Let's do this, Dad," she whispered, her breath forming a small cloud in the cold air. The streets were quieter than usual, the neighborhood subdued under the weight of the holiday and the chill. Layla's boots crunched against the frosted ground as she made her way down the block. She passed by Mrs. Carter's house first, the elderly woman waving from her porch. "Where you headed, sweetie?" Mrs. Carter called, her breath puffing like smoke. "To the church," Layla answered, stopping briefly. Mrs. Carter disappeared inside and returned with a small jar of homemade jam. "Take this with you. You never know when it might come in handy." Layla accepted it gratefully, tucking it into her coat pocket. "Thank you, Mrs. Carter." Further down the street, she spotted Tyrone, a teenage boy who was always hanging out on the corner with his friends. "Where are you going with that old thing?" he teased, nodding at her cart. Layla rolled her eyes but kept walking. "None of your business, Tyrone." "Hey, I'm just saying. It looks like it's about to fall apart," he called after her, though there was no malice in his tone. She ignored him, focusing on her goal. The church wasn't far, but the biting wind made every step feel like a mile. By the time she arrived, her fingers were numb, despite her gloves. Pastor Miller greeted her warmly at the door. "Good morning, Layla. Come in before you freeze." The warmth of the church was a welcome relief. Layla joined the line of people waiting for food, her eyes scanning the shelves stocked with donations. When her turn came, she received a box with canned goods, bread, and a small carton of milk. "Thank you, Pastor," she said, her voice sincere. "You're most welcome, Layla," he replied, his kind eyes twinkling. "Tell your mother I said hello." Layla loaded the supplies into her cart and braced herself for the trek home. As she left the church, the wind seemed to howl louder, pushing against her with every step. Her mind wandered back to her father, to his unwavering kindness and the strength he always seemed to exude. The journey was harder now, the cart feeling heavier as her energy waned. She passed familiar streets and faces, her neighborhood a tapestry of resilience and struggle. Every corner held a story, every face a reflection of her own challenges. The box of food rattling with every bump, the cold, sharp wind whipped against her face, and the gray clouds above threatened rain. She pulled her scarf tighter, her breath forming small puffs as she trudged forward. The weight of responsibility sat heavily on her small shoulders, but she carried it with quiet determination. As she turned the corner toward the underpass of the L station, the first drops of rain began to fall. Layla sighed, quickening her pace as the drizzle turned into a steady downpour. She steered the cart carefully, trying to keep the food dry, when she noticed a figure huddled on the bench beneath the station. The man was older, his face lined with deep wrinkles and framed by a scruffy beard. He wore a tattered coat, far too thin for the weather, and clutched a cardboard sign that read, "Hungry and cold. Anything helps." His head hung low, his shoulders sagging as though the weight of the world bore down on him. Layla stopped, her eyes lingering on him. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. Kindness costs nothing. She hesitated, glancing at the box of food in her cart. There wasn't much to spare, but something about the man's presence tugged at her heart. "Excuse me, sir," Layla called softly, taking a cautious step forward. The man's head lifted slightly, revealing piercing blue eyes that seemed out of place against his worn appearance. He studied her for a moment before responding in a gravelly voice. "Yes? I... I have some bread," she stammered, reaching into the cart. "Would you like some?" A faint smile crossed his face, though his eyes remained guarded. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice carrying a note of surprise. As she handed him the loaf of bread, a sudden thought struck her. She glanced at the rain-soaked street and then back at the man. "Actually, would you like to come to my house? It's not much, but we're having Thanksgiving dinner. You shouldn't be out here in the cold." The man blinked, his expression shifting from surprise to something unreadable. "Your house?" "Yes," Layla said firmly, though her heart raced. "We don't have a lot, but there's enough to share." The man hesitated, his gaze flickering to her cart and then back to her earnest face. For a moment, Layla thought he might refuse. Then he nodded slowly. "All right. Thank you. I'd be grateful." Layla smiled, a small warmth spreading in her chest despite the rain. "Come on, it's not far," she said, turning back toward the road. The man rose from the bench, clutching the bread in one hand and steadying himself with the other. He walked with a slight limp, but his steps were deliberate. As they moved together through the downpour, Layla couldn't help but notice the way he carried himself. Not like someone defeated by life, but with a quiet strength that didn't match his circumstances. "What's your name?" she asked after a while, breaking the silence. "Elliot," he replied. "And you?" "Layla," she said brightly. "It's nice to meet you, Elliot." Elliot nodded but said nothing more. They continued in silence for a while, the rain drumming against the pavement. Layla glanced at him occasionally, curious about the man who had appeared so suddenly in her life. When they reached a particularly large puddle, Layla struggled to maneuver the cart around it. Elliot stepped forward without a word, gripping the front of the cart and lifting it over the puddle. "Thank you," Layla said, a little embarrassed. Elliot shrugged. "You shouldn't be doing this alone. It's heavy work for someone your size." "I'm used to it," Layla replied. "My dad taught me how to take care of things when he was here." Her voice trailed off and she looked away. Elliot didn't press further, but his gaze softened. "He must have been a good man." "He was," Layla said quietly. The rest of the walk passed in a strange, companionable silence. Layla found herself wondering about Elliot, where he came from, how he ended up on that bench. There was something about him that didn't quite fit. His movements were deliberate, his voice calm and measured, as though he were used to giving orders. When they finally arrived at Layla's building, she turned to him. "It's not much, but it's warm," she said. "That's more than enough," Elliot replied, his voice low but sincere. Layla led him up the creaky stairs, her thoughts racing. She wasn't sure how her mother would react to this unexpected guest, but deep down, she felt she was doing the right thing. As Layla opened the door to her apartment, the warm, albeit faint glow of a single lamp greeted her and Elliot. She stepped aside to let him in, suddenly aware of how small their home must seem to him. The living room doubled as the dining area, with a modest couch pressed against the wall and a rickety table at its center. The air carried the faint smell of soup warming on the stove, a testament to Miriam's effort despite her illness. "Mama, I'm back," Layla called, tugging the cart into the corner. Miriam appeared from the kitchen, her face pale but kind. She paused when she saw Elliot, her gaze quickly scanning his appearance. Layla noticed the subtle shift in her expression, a mix of surprise and hesitation. "Mama, this is Elliot," Layla said, her voice steady. "I met him on the way back, and I thought, well, it's Thanksgiving. I invited him to join us." Miriam hesitated, her hand gripping the edge of the doorframe for support. Then with a small nod, she stepped forward, extending her hand. "Welcome, Elliot. It's not much, but you're welcome here." "Thank you, ma'am," Elliot said, his tone measured and polite. His handshake was firm but gentle, a contrast to his weathered appearance. As the three settled at the table, Layla busied herself setting out the food. Miriam's eyes lingered on Elliot, her mind clearly turning over questions she wasn't ready to ask. Elliot, for his part, seemed at ease, though his sharp blue eyes missed nothing. "So, Elliot," Miriam began, breaking the silence, "where are you from?" Elliot paused as if deciding how much to share. "I've been a lot of places," he said finally, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Used to live in the city, a different part of it anyway. But it's been a while." "Were you in business?" Miriam asked, her tone casual but probing. "You have the air of someone who's seen a lot." Elliot chuckled, a low, rich sound that seemed to surprise even him. "You could say that. I worked in finance for a time. It was another life." Layla's eyes widened. "Finance? Like banks and stuff?" "Something like that," Elliot replied, his gaze softening as he looked at her. "It's been years, though. These days, I prefer simpler things." Miriam nodded, though her expression remained guarded. "Simpler things are good," she said, "but they don't always come easy." "No, they don't," Elliot agreed, his voice carrying a note of understanding. The meal was simple but comforting: thick slices of toasted bread, a steaming pot of bean soup, and roasted sweet potatoes that filled the small apartment with a sweet, earthy aroma. Layla carefully ladled the soup into mismatched bowls, her hands steady despite the excitement bubbling in her chest. This wasn't the feast she had once dreamed of for Thanksgiving, but it was enough. It was theirs. As they all sat at the table, Layla clasped her hands together. "Can we pray first?" she asked, her voice soft but resolute. Miriam nodded, folding her hands in her lap. Elliot hesitated for a moment, then followed suit, lowering his gaze. The flickering candlelight danced across their faces, casting a warm glow in the dim room. Layla took a deep breath and closed her eyes. "Thank you, Lord, for this food, for my mama, and for bringing Mr. Elliot here tonight. Please watch over all the people who don't have a home, who don't have food, and please tell my dad we miss him and love him very much. Amen." A heavy silence followed, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Elliot glanced at Layla, something unreadable in his expression, and Miriam wiped the corner of her eye discreetly. Layla smiled shyly and reached for her spoon, the warmth in her chest growing with every passing moment. That Thanksgiving meal might not have been abundant, but it was rich with gratitude, connection, and hope, a reflection of what the holiday was truly about. As they ate, the conversation meandered through lighter topics. Elliot shared snippets of his former life, careful to avoid specifics, but dropping enough details to intrigue both Layla and Miriam. He spoke of grand offices and high-rise buildings, of deals that spanned countries and currencies. His stories painted a picture of a world far removed from the modest room they sat in. "You must have been very successful," Miriam said at one point, her tone neutral but her eyes sharp. "Success is a funny thing," Elliot replied, his gaze distant. "It can mean a lot or very little, depending on what you value." Layla, sensing a weight in his words, changed the subject. "Mama, did you see the jar of jam Mrs. Carter gave me? We should have it with the bread." "Good idea," Miriam said, smiling at her daughter. "She's always been so thoughtful." As Layla retrieved the jar, the lights flickered once, twice, and then went out entirely. The apartment plunged into darkness, and Layla let out a small gasp. "It's all right," Miriam said, her voice calm but strained. "The power goes out sometimes when the wind's bad. Layla, get the candles." Layla fumbled her way to the cupboard, retrieving a few stubby candles and lighting them with matches. The soft glow filled the room, casting flickering shadows on the walls. "Well," Elliot said, leaning back in his chair, "this reminds me of camping, except a bit warmer." Layla giggled, her initial fear replaced by a sense of adventure. "Have you been camping a lot?" "A few times," Elliot said, a hint of a smile playing on his lips, though not always by choice. "Tell us a story," Layla said eagerly. Elliot glanced at Miriam, who nodded, her expression softening for the first time. He leaned forward, his face illuminated by the candlelight, and began. "There was this one time," he said, "when I was much younger. I was hiking with a group, colleagues really, and we got caught in a storm. We took shelter in a cave, but we didn't have much in the way of supplies. It was cold, wet, and miserable, but it also taught me a lot about resourcefulness. You'd be amazed what you can do with a little ingenuity." "What did you do?" Layla asked, her eyes wide. "Well," Elliot said, his voice lightening, "we used every scrap of material we had, coats, scarves, even shoelaces, to rig up a way to catch rainwater. It wasn't much, but it got us through the night." Miriam listened intently, her earlier wariness giving way to curiosity. "You must have been a natural leader." "Not always," Elliot said, his tone quiet. "But I learned." The room fell silent for a moment, the only sound the soft crackle of the candles. Layla looked between her mother and Elliot, sensing a connection forming despite the unspoken questions that lingered. "Well," Miriam said finally, "you've certainly had an interesting life." "It's been eventful," Elliot admitted. The power returned with a sudden hum, startling them all. Layla laughed, the tension breaking. "That was perfect timing." Elliot smiled, his face softening in the warm light. "I'd say so." As the evening wore on, the trio's conversation grew lighter, punctuated by laughter and shared memories. For the first time in a long time, the small apartment felt full of warmth, of connection, of something neither Layla nor Miriam could quite name. The soft hum of electricity returning had eased the momentary tension in the room. As the light bathed the apartment once more, Layla grinned at Elliot. For a few hours, the weight of the world seemed lighter, less daunting. Even Miriam, though pale and tired, had smiled through much of the evening. Elliot's stories had brought life to the small table, making the simple meal feel like a grand occasion. But that calm wouldn't last. Later that night, as Layla cleared the table, Miriam rose from her chair, steadying herself against its edge. Her face suddenly contorted in pain as she coughed, a deep, wet sound that seemed to come from her very core. Layla froze, her hands tightening around the plate she was holding. "Mama?" she asked, her voice trembling. Miriam raised a hand trying to signal she was fine, but the coughs grew harsher. She clutched her chest, her knees buckling slightly. Elliot was on his feet in an instant, his calm demeanor replaced by urgency. "Layla, put the plate down," he said, his voice firm but steady. "Help me get her to the couch." Layla obeyed without thinking, rushing to her mother's side. Together, she and Elliot guided Miriam to the worn couch in the living room. Miriam's breaths came in short, labored gasps as her coughing subsided, leaving her visibly drained. "I'm fine," Miriam managed to rasp, though the strain in her voice betrayed her words. "You're not," Elliot said sharply but not unkindly. He turned to Layla. "Do you have a phone?" Layla nodded, scrambling to grab the old flip phone from the kitchen counter. Her hands shook as she handed it to Elliot. He dialed quickly, his voice steady as he relayed the situation to the dispatcher. "The ambulance is on its way," he said after hanging up. Layla knelt beside her mother, tears welling in her eyes. "Mama, please don't scare me like that," she whispered. Miriam reached out weakly, placing a hand on Layla's cheek. "I'm sorry, baby. I think I pushed too hard today." Elliot knelt next to them, his gaze sharp but kind. "It's more than that. This isn't just being tired, Miriam." He spoke with an authority that surprised Layla, as though he'd been in this position many times before. Moments later, the distant wail of sirens grew louder. Layla's heart pounded as two paramedics entered the apartment, their presence a stark contrast to the cozy, candlelit atmosphere of earlier. Elliot stepped back, allowing them room to assess Miriam. Her breathing is shallow, one of the paramedics said, glancing at her partner. We need to get her to the hospital. Can I come with her? Layla asked, panic lacing her voice. The paramedic nodded. Of course, but only one of you. I'll stay, Elliot said quickly, his calm tone meant to reassure Layla. Go with her. I'll be here when you get back. Layla hesitated but knew her place was with her mother. As she climbed into the back of the ambulance, she glanced at Elliot, who stood in the doorway, his face a mixture of concern and resolve. The ride to the hospital felt both agonizingly slow and impossibly fast. Layla clutched her mother's hand tightly, whispering words of encouragement that felt inadequate. Miriam gave her a faint smile, her strength seeming to waver with each passing moment. When they arrived, the paramedics wheeled Miriam into the emergency room, and Layla was directed to a waiting area. She sat alone, the sterile smell of the hospital and the low hum of fluorescent lights amplifying her fear. A nurse approached after what felt like an eternity. Your mother is stable, she said, her voice professional but kind. She has pneumonia, and it's advanced. She'll need to be admitted for treatment. Relief flooded Layla momentarily, but it was quickly replaced by dread. How long will she need to stay? It depends on how she responds to treatment, the nurse explained. But I'll be honest, without insurance, the cost could be significant. Layla's stomach sank. She knew their finances were already stretched thin. The thought of another burden, another weight, seemed unbearable. She sat back down, her hands trembling. What are we going to do, Mama? She whispered, even though Miriam wasn't there to answer. Hours passed. Layla dozed off in the stiff waiting room chair, waking to the sound of someone clearing their throat. She looked up to see a man in a suit standing a few feet away, his hands clasped in front of him. Miss Green? He asked gently. Layla nodded, her heart racing. Yes? I'm with the hospital's financial office, he said, his tone calm but neutral. I wanted to let you know that your mother's initial costs have been covered by an anonymous benefactor. Layla blinked, the words not registering at first. Wait. What? All expenses up to this point have been paid in full, the man clarified. We've been instructed to extend the same arrangement to her ongoing care as needed. Who? Layla began, but the man shook his head. I'm afraid I'm not authorized to disclose that information, he said, but you should know your mother will receive the care she needs. As the man walked away, Layla sat in stunned silence. Her mind raced, piecing together the possibilities. She thought of Elliot, his calm demeanor, his resourcefulness, and the way he seemed to understand too much for someone in his position. Could it have been him? Her chest tightened with gratitude and confusion. She would have to find out, but for now all that mattered was that her mother would be okay. Miriam remained in the ICU, her frail body connected to an array of machines that beeped steadily in the dimly lit room. Layla sat beside her mother, her small hand clutching Miriam's pale fingers. The sight of the oxygen mask and the intravenous lines made Layla's chest tighten. Her mother, who had always been her anchor, now seemed so fragile, so vulnerable. It's okay, Mama, Layla whispered, her voice trembling. You're going to be okay. I'm right here. Miriam stirred slightly, her eyelids fluttering but not opening. Layla tightened her grip, forcing herself to stay calm even as fear threatened to overwhelm her. A soft knock at the door drew her attention. Layla turned to see Pastor Miller standing in the doorway, his warm, familiar presence, a small comfort amidst the sterile surroundings. His kind eyes lit up as they met hers, and he stepped into the room quietly, careful not to disturb Miriam. Layla, he said gently, his voice low and steady. He placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. I heard about your mother. How is she doing? Layla hesitated, glancing at her mother before answering. She's stable. For now, she said softly. But the doctors said it's pneumonia and it's bad. Pastor Miller nodded solemnly. Pneumonia is serious, but she's in good hands. Have faith. Layla swallowed hard, her gaze dropping to her lap. I'm trying, Pastor. I really am. But the bills, someone paid them. And I don't know who. Pastor Miller's brows knitted together, his expression a mix of curiosity and surprise. Paid? By someone here at the hospital? Layla nodded slowly, the confusion evident in her voice. The man from the financial office said it was anonymous. They wouldn't tell me who, but I think it might be Elliot. Elliot? Pastor Miller's tone shifted slightly, his interest piqued. The man you brought to dinner? Yes, Layla said quickly, her words spilling out as she tried to make sense of it. He said he used to be in finance, and the way he talks, it's like he knows things, important things. He's not like the other people I've met who are struggling. There's something about him that's different. Pastor Miller's gaze softened, and a thoughtful smile touched his lips. Sometimes, Layla, people carry more than they show. They don't always tell you their whole story, but their actions can speak volumes. Kindness has a way of revealing unexpected truths about someone. Layla stared at him, her thoughts swirling. Pastor Miller's words felt like they carried a deeper meaning, as though he too sensed that Elliot was more than he appeared. After Pastor Miller left, Layla returned to her mother's bedside. The rhythmic beeping of the monitors was the only sound in the room, but Layla's mind was far from quiet. She thought of Elliot, his calm demeanor, his quiet confidence, and the way he had stepped in to help them during the ambulance ride. Could he really have been the one to pay the bills, she whispered to her mother, though she knew Miriam was too weak to respond. Mama, do you think he could be an angel or something? I mean, he just showed up, and now all of this. Her voice trailed off as she stared at her mother's pale face. She heard the familiar shuffle of heavy footsteps. She looked up, startled, to see him standing in the doorway. Elliot still wore the same tattered coat from the night before, rain stains darkening its edges. His face was calm, but his piercing blue eyes held a hint of something, regret, perhaps, or hesitation. Layla blinked in surprise, rising slowly to her feet. Elliot, she said softly, you're here. I am, he replied, his voice steady but low. He stepped closer, his presence filling the small, sterile space. I came to check on your mother. And on you. Layla's heart swelled at his words, but she couldn't ignore the growing suspicion gnawing at her. Mama's stable, she said, her voice laced with both relief and weariness. But someone paid for her bills. Was it you? Elliot's expression didn't change, but his silence spoke louder than words. He looked at her for a long moment before shaking his head slightly. Does it matter who paid them? Yes, Layla said firmly. It matters to me. Elliot sighed, his shoulders sagging slightly. He leaned against the edge of the small waiting room table, his gaze drifting to the floor. Layla, sometimes people do things because they see a moment, a chance to make a difference. That's what matters, not who they are or where they're from. Layla tilted her head, studying him intently. That's not an answer, she said, her voice quiet but insistent. Elliot met her gaze then, his blue eyes softening. You're a smart girl, he said with a faint smile. And you've been through more than most your age. I can see why your mother's so proud of you. Don't change the subject, Layla said, crossing her arms. Elliot chuckled softly, though it lacked humor. All right, he said after a pause. Let's just say I had some connections, and I wanted to help. Your family deserves a break, Layla. That's all you need to know. Layla's lips parted, a dozen more questions bubbling to the surface. But before she could speak, Elliot straightened, his demeanor shifting. I wanted to let you know, he said, his tone more serious now. I'll be leaving town for a while. There's something I need to take care of, some unfinished business. Layla frowned, the thought of him leaving filling her with an unexpected sense of loss. Leaving? But why? Elliot hesitated, his gaze flickering toward the window. Sometimes life has a way of catching up to you, he said vaguely. And there are things I need to face, things I've put off for too long. You're not just going to disappear, are you? Layla asked, her voice trembling slightly. No, Elliot said firmly. I'll be back. I just need some time. Layla wanted to believe him, but the thought of his absence left a heaviness in her chest. Will you at least stay until Mama's better? She asked, her voice small. Elliot looked at her, his expression softening. I wish I could, he said quietly, but this can't wait. He stepped closer then, placing a hand on her shoulder. Layla, you're stronger than you realize. You've already done more for your mother than most people could in your shoes. Don't doubt yourself. Layla blinked back the sting of tears, her lips pressing into a thin line. I'm going to hold you to your promise, Elliot, she said. You better come back. Elliot smiled faintly, his hand falling away. I always keep my promises. With that, he turned and walked toward the door. Layla watched him go, her heart heavy with unanswered questions and the nagging feeling that there was more to his story than he had let on. The door to the hospital waiting room swung shut, leaving Layla staring at the empty space where Elliot had just stood. His departure felt abrupt, a finality lingering in the air that she hadn't anticipated. She clutched the note he had left earlier, a small piece of paper with words that were both a reassurance and a mystery. Keep faith. You're not alone. As the hours passed, Layla remained by her mother's side in the ICU, her thoughts consumed by Elliot. His cryptic words, his calm demeanor, and the way he'd stepped into their lives at just the right moment. It all felt deliberate, as though he had been sent by some unseen force. The following week brought a sense of cautious relief for Layla. Her mother, Miriam, was slowly improving under the care of the hospital staff. Her breathing grew steadier, her complexion less pale, and after 7 long days, the doctors finally gave her clearance to go home. Layla couldn't hide her joy as she helped her mother into a wheelchair for the discharge process. Though Miriam was still frail, her smile was warm, her eyes filled with gratitude. Pastor Miller, who had been a steady presence throughout their ordeal, arrived at the hospital just in time to help. Let's get you both home, he said gently, his kind smile easing some of Layla's lingering worry. Layla nodded, clutching her small bag of belongings as Pastor Miller wheeled Miriam toward the hospital exit. The three of them made their way through the bustling streets to the family's modest apartment. As they approached the building, Layla paused mid-step. Sitting on the porch was a large cardboard box, sealed neatly and marked with the words, "For Layla and Miriam." Her heart skipped a beat as she glanced at Pastor Miller. "Did you?" she began, but he shook his head with a knowing smile. "No, Layla, but I think I might know who did." They reached the box together, and Pastor Miller leaned down to lift it. Despite its weight, he carried it with ease, placing it just inside the door as Layla opened it wide. Inside the box were neatly packed food items, canned goods, fresh produce, bread, and even a few treats like cookies and tea. Layla stared in disbelief. How? Who would do this? Pastor Miller placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression soft but serious. Elliot, he said simply. Layla's eyes widened. Elliot? But he said he was leaving. How could he? Pastor Miller sighed, sitting down at the kitchen table as Layla helped Miriam to the couch. Once Miriam was settled, he turned back to Layla. Elliot didn't just leave, Layla, he explained. He reached out to me before he went. Wanted to make sure I'd keep an eye on you and your mother. He wanted to know that you'd both be all right. Layla felt a lump rising in her throat. He's been keeping track of us. In a way, Pastor Miller said with a gentle nod, Elliot has a way of staying connected, even when he's not physically here. This, he gestured toward the box, is his way of making sure you know he hasn't forgotten about you. Layla sank into a chair, her hands trembling slightly as she stared at the box. But why? Why does he care so much about us? Pastor Miller's smile was tinged with sadness. I think Elliot sees something in you and your mother, something that reminds him of what he lost. Helping you is his way of finding peace, Layla. Miriam, who had been quietly listening from the couch, spoke up, her voice still soft but steady. He's a good man, she said, and sometimes good people do things not for recognition, but because it's the right thing to do. Layla nodded slowly, her heart swelling with gratitude and a lingering ache. She traced the edge of the box with her fingers, thinking of the man who had come into their lives so unexpectedly and left an indelible mark. That night, as she prepared the first proper meal they'd had in weeks, Layla thought about Elliot's words the last time she saw him. Keep faith. You're not alone. She didn't know when or if he would return, but she held on to his promise. For now the food he had left, the kindness he had shown, and the hope he had ignited were enough to carry them forward. Miriam's recovery was slow but steady, and with Pastor Miller's support, Layla felt stronger than she had in weeks. Together they began to rebuild the fragile pieces of their lives, one day at a time. And though Elliot was no longer there, his presence lingered in every small act of kindness they received. Suddenly a memory surfaced. During their dinner, Elliot had mentioned working in finance, a vague reference that seemed incongruous with his current state. Layla decided she needed answers. The next day after school, she visited the public library. With the help of an old computer, she began searching for any mention of an Elliot Harper connected to finance. It didn't take long for the results to appear. Her breath caught as she clicked on an article. The headline read, "Former financial mogul Elliot Harper steps down after family tragedy." The article was dated nearly a decade earlier. Layla skimmed the text, her heart pounding as the details came together. Elliot had once been a prominent figure in the financial world, running a multi-million-dollar firm. But everything changed after a plane crash claimed the lives of his wife and son. Devastated, he had withdrawn from public life, selling off his assets and disappearing from the business world. Layla leaned back in her chair, the words blurring on the screen. Elliot's cryptic remarks suddenly made sense. His stories about a former life, his careful deflection of questions. He wasn't just a kind stranger. He was a man who had lost everything and was trying to find his way back to some semblance of meaning. Her heart ached for him. She couldn't imagine the pain of losing so much, of carrying that kind of grief. But it also made her more determined to find him. Elliot had stepped into her life when she needed him most. Now it was her turn to return the favor. Over the next few days, Layla kept her discovery to herself, not wanting to burden her mother. Miriam was growing stronger, and Layla knew she needed to focus on helping her fully recover. But every spare moment was spent thinking about Elliot, where he might have gone, what he might be doing. One afternoon, as she left the hospital, Layla spotted a black car idling near the curb. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, she thought it might be Elliot. But as she approached, the window rolled down to reveal a man she didn't recognize. "Miss Green?" the man asked, his tone polite but formal. "Yes?" Layla replied cautiously. The man handed her an envelope. "This is for you." Before she could ask further questions, the car pulled away, leaving her standing on the sidewalk, confused. She opened the envelope to find a letter written in the same neat handwriting as the note Elliot had left. It read, "Layla, sometimes helping others is the only way to help ourselves. Keep being strong for your mother and for yourself. I'll be back when the time is right." Tears welled in her eyes as she clutched the letter tightly. Elliot was gone for now, but he hadn't forgotten her. And in his absence, Layla felt a renewed sense of purpose. Elliot's disappearance wasn't the end of his story. It was just another chapter, one she was determined to see through to its conclusion. It started with the landlord, Mr. Reed. He was a stern man, tall and wiry, with a perpetual scowl etched into his face. For years, Mr. Reed had maintained the apartment building with minimal effort, patching leaks only when absolutely necessary and ignoring complaints until they piled too high to dismiss. Now, however, things were worse. Notices began appearing on the doors of several apartments, including Layla's. Bold red letters declared, "Final warning, rent overdue, pay immediately or face eviction." Layla's stomach twisted when she saw the paper tacked to their door. She yanked it down, clutching it tightly as she entered the apartment. Miriam was resting on the couch, still pale but stronger than before. She looked up, concern flickering across her face. "What's that?" Miriam asked, her voice tinged with weariness. Layla hesitated, then handed her the notice. Miriam's hands trembled slightly as she read it, her expression tightening. "Rent," she murmured. I thought we had more time." "We'll figure it out," Layla said quickly, though her heart pounded. Later that day, Pastor Miller stopped by to check on them. Layla handed him the notice, her voice shaky as she explained the situation. "I'll talk to Mr. Reed," Pastor Miller said firmly. "In the meantime, let's focus on what we can do." Layla nodded, determination hardening her resolve. She couldn't let her mother carry this burden alone. The next day, Layla sat at the kitchen table, an array of beads and strings spread out before her. She had always loved making bracelets, simple, colorful bands that she sometimes gave to friends or kept as her own small treasures. Now they felt like a lifeline. Her plan was simple: make as many bracelets as she could and sell them around the neighborhood. It wasn't much, but it was something. As she worked, she heard a knock at the door. When she opened it, she found Tyrone standing there, hands shoved into his pockets. "Hey," he said, his tone awkward. "I heard about the notice. Everyone's talking about it. You okay?" Layla frowned, crossing her arms. "We're fine. Why do you care?" Tyrone shrugged, looking away. "I don't, really. Just thought, maybe you could use some help or whatever." Layla narrowed her eyes, studying him for a moment before stepping aside. "Come in." To her surprise, Tyrone sat at the table and started stringing beads without complaint. His fingers fumbled at first, but he quickly found a rhythm. "This is kinda lame," he muttered, though his tone lacked malice. "Then why are you doing it?" Layla shot back, her hands working swiftly. Tyrone shrugged again. "My mom used to say, helping people's good for the soul or something. Figured I'd give it a shot." Layla's lips twitched into a small smile despite herself. "Well, your mom sounds smart." By the end of the day, they had finished a dozen bracelets. Layla packed them carefully into a small box and set out with Tyrone to sell them. The neighborhood streets were both familiar and foreboding. Layla and Tyrone knocked on doors, offering their bracelets to anyone who would listen. Some neighbors bought one or two, others simply shook their heads and closed the door. At one house, Mrs. Carter, the retired teacher, greeted them warmly. "Bracelets?" she said, inspecting their handiwork. "What are these for?" Layla hesitated, unsure how much to share, but Tyrone spoke up. "They're for rent money," he said bluntly. "You know Mr. Reed's been leaving those notices everywhere." Mrs. Carter sighed, her expression softening. "I'll take 3, she said, pulling a few bills from her purse. "And don't you worry, that man's bark is worse than his bite." Despite Mrs. Carter's reassurance, Layla couldn't shake the fear that lingered in the back of her mind. By the end of the afternoon, she and Tyrone had sold enough bracelets to scrape together a small amount of money. It wasn't much, but it was a start. That evening, Pastor Miller returned with news. He had spoken to Mr. Reed, who reluctantly agreed to extend the deadline for Layla's family and a few other tenants. "But it's only temporary," Pastor Miller warned. "We'll need to figure out something more permanent." The neighborhood's struggles hadn't eased. Notices of overdue rent still dotted doors like ominous reminders of the precariousness of their lives. Layla knew the temporary reprieve Pastor Miller had negotiated with Mr. Reed wouldn't last. They needed something more permanent, something that would not only save their home, but also bring stability to everyone in the building. It was late one evening, after another long day of making and selling bracelets, that Layla found herself sitting with Pastor Miller in the small community room of the church. The warm glow of a single lamp illuminated their conversation as Layla poured out her thoughts. "We can't keep living like this," she said, her voice firm despite the exhaustion in her eyes. "Even if we make enough to cover this month's rent, what happens next month? And what about the other families? We need a real solution." Pastor Miller nodded, his brow furrowed in thought. "You're right, Layla, but what do you have in mind?" Layla hesitated, her fingers fiddling with the hem of her sweater. "I've been thinking, what if we all came together? The whole building. If we can show Mr. Reed that we're serious about making this a better place, maybe he'll listen." "An interesting idea," Pastor Miller said, stroking his chin. "But Mr. Reed isn't exactly known for his compassion." "Then we'll make him see it's in his best interest," Layla replied, determination flashing in her eyes. The next day, Layla went door to door in the apartment building, explaining her plan to the other tenants. Most were hesitant at first, their expressions weary and doubtful. "Reed doesn't care about us," said Mrs. Hernandez, a mother of 3 who lived on the first floor. "He'll just find another reason to kick us out." "He might," Layla admitted, her voice steady. "But if we don't try, we're all going to end up on the streets. Together, we can make a difference." Her passion was contagious. Slowly, the tenants began to rally behind her. By the end of the day, they had agreed to hold a meeting in the courtyard to discuss their collective grievances and solutions. When the day of the meeting arrived, the courtyard buzzed with nervous energy. Families gathered in small clusters, whispering to one another while Layla stood at the center with Pastor Miller by her side. Even Tyrone, who rarely showed interest in anything serious, leaned against a wall, watching intently. Layla took a deep breath and stepped forward. "We all know why we're here," she began, her voice steady but loud enough to carry. "This building is falling apart. Leaks, broken windows, heating that barely works. And now, eviction notices. We deserve better." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. "But we can't just sit around waiting for someone else to fix it," Layla continued. "We have to show Mr. Reed that we care about this place, that we're willing to work together to make it better. If we can do that, maybe he'll see that investing in us is worth it." "How do you know he'll listen?" an older man in the back called out. "We don't," Layla admitted. "But if we don't try, nothing will change." The crowd fell silent, her words sinking in. Slowly, hands began to rise, signaling agreement. The next step was approaching Mr. Reed. Layla, accompanied by Pastor Miller and a few of the tenants, knocked on his door. He opened it with a scowl, his eyes narrowing as he took in the group. "What do you want?" he snapped. Layla stepped forward, her chin held high. "We want to talk to you about the building." Reed crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe. "Talk? About what? None of you can even pay rent on time." Layla didn't flinch. "That's part of the problem. If this building were better maintained, if we had working heat, fixed plumbing, and no leaks, we could attract new tenants. You'd make more money and we'd have a better place to live. Everyone wins." Reed snorted, his face twisting into a sneer. "Are you kidding me? You think I've got money to waste on this dump? If you can't pay your rent, that's on you, not me." Pastor Miller took a step forward, his voice calm but unwavering. "Mr. Reed, we're not asking you to take on this alone. The tenants are ready to put in the work, to make this a better place for everyone. All they need is your cooperation." Reed cut him off with a sharp laugh, his tone dripping with disdain. "Cooperation? Do you think I care about a bunch of freeloaders who can't even keep up with their rent? This building isn't a charity, Pastor. If they can't pay, they can pack their bags and leave." Layla stepped forward, her small hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Mr. Reed, we're trying to make things better for everyone. You could have a building full of tenants who actually care, who want to stay and help." "Enough!" Reed barked, his face reddening. "I don't want to hear another word. I've already wasted enough time on this nonsense." He grabbed the edge of the door, glaring at the group. "You think you can pressure me into doing things your way? Guess what? You're all replaceable. If you don't like how I run this place, you're free to leave." With that, he slammed the door so hard that the frame rattled, leaving Layla, Pastor Miller, and the others standing in stunned silence on the dimly lit hallway. Layla felt her chest tighten, her anger and frustration threatening to spill over. "How can he be like this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Pastor Miller placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Some people build walls around their hearts, Layla. It doesn't mean we give up. It means we keep trying." Layla nodded slowly, though her eyes burned with unshed tears. She wasn't ready to give up, not yet. Mr. Reed might have slammed the door in their faces, but he hadn't silenced their determination. The neighborhood was unusually quiet that Sunday afternoon. Most of the families from Layla's building had gathered at the church for a special service, a moment of solace amidst the uncertainty surrounding their homes. The warm hum of the congregation's voices lifted spirits, but for Layla, a persistent worry gnawed at her. As the service concluded and people began mingling in the church hall, Layla noticed Pastor Miller walking toward her, his expression unreadable. Before she could ask him what was wrong, the church doors creaked open and a figure stepped inside. It was Mr. Reed. Layla's stomach clenched at the sight of him. His usual scowl was in place, but there was something different about him. An unease, a hesitation that didn't fit the brusque landlord they had faced before. The crowd fell silent as Reed cleared his throat, his gaze sweeping over the gathered families. His discomfort was palpable, but he spoke with a gruff authority. "I've got something to say," he began, his voice rough but slightly subdued. "You all know I've been running this building for years, and I'll admit it hasn't been easy. Keeping it up, dealing with complaints, chasing down late rent. I've had enough. Layla's heart sank, and she felt Miriam's hand tighten on her shoulder. Was this it? The moment Reed would announce their eviction, shattering the fragile hope they'd tried to build? Reed shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting to Pastor Miller, who nodded at him in silent encouragement. But things are going to change, Reed continued, his voice softening slightly. Someone's bought the building. The room erupted in murmurs, questions buzzing through the air like static. Layla stepped forward, her voice cutting through the noise. Bought the building? What do you mean? Reed frowned but didn't snap at her like she expected. Exactly what I said, he replied. Someone else owns it now. As of yesterday, I'm no longer your landlord. Miriam's voice was quiet but steady. And what does that mean for us? Reed looked around the room, his face pinched with what might have been regret, or perhaps relief. It means you're staying, he said simply. No evictions, no more notices. A stunned silence filled the church hall, and then a wave of whispers rippled through the crowd. Layla's heart raced, her mind struggling to process the words. We're staying? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, Reed said, his tone sharp but not unkind. The new owner made it clear they're not kicking anyone out, and they plan to fix the place up. The murmurs grew louder, a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope spreading through the room. Layla stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. Who bought it? Who's the new owner? Reed hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line. Don't know much about them, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. All I know is they paid in full and told me to hand over the keys. Layla's mind raced. She thought of the note on their doorstep, the envelope with the letter, the man who had stepped into their lives like a quiet storm. It couldn't be a coincidence. Elliot, she whispered, her heart pounding. Reed shot her a glance, his scowl returning slightly. If you know something, that's your business. All I know is I'm out. You're someone else's problem now. Pastor Miller stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. Mr. Reed, thank you for coming here to share this with us. It couldn't have been easy. Reed grunted, his expression softening for a brief moment. I didn't have to come here, you know, but maybe I owed it to all of you to say it in person. He turned to leave, pausing in the doorway. Good luck, he said gruffly, and then he was gone. The room remained silent for a moment longer, as if no one dared to believe what they just heard. Then slowly, the tension began to ease. Smiles appeared, tentative at first, but growing brighter with each passing second. Layla felt Miriam's hand squeeze her shoulder again, and she turned to see her mother's face lit with a rare, genuine smile. We're staying, baby, Miriam said softly. We're going to be okay. Layla nodded, though her thoughts were already elsewhere. She needed to know for sure. Was this Elliot's doing? Had he really stepped in, once again, to save them all? As the families began to talk excitedly about their future, Pastor Miller approached Layla, his gaze knowing. You're thinking about Elliot, aren't you? Layla nodded. Do you think it was him? Pastor Miller smiled gently. I'd say it's very likely. But whoever it was, Layla, remember this. It's not just about who did it, it's about what happens next. This is a chance for all of you to build something better, together. Layla looked around at the hopeful faces of her neighbors, at the children laughing, and the parents exchanging relieved smiles. For the first time in a long time, the weight on her shoulders felt a little lighter. The days following Mr. Reed's announcement were unlike anything the building had seen in years. The air buzzed with excitement and relief, and for the first time in recent memory, the residents weren't just neighbors. They were a community. Word spread quickly about the new ownership, though the identity of the buyer remained a mystery. While whispers about Elliot Harper circled among some, most were content to focus on the present, their chance to finally make the building a home worth staying in. Layla stood in the middle of the courtyard, hands on her hips, surveying the scene. Around her, families worked together, cleaning years of grime from walls, sweeping the cracked pavement, and hauling trash to the curb. Tyrone, she called, spotting him slacking off in the corner, leaning against a broom. You're supposed to be helping, not just standing there. Tyrone groaned but grabbed the broom reluctantly. I'm helping. Just Supervising, he said with a smirk. Layla rolled her eyes. Supervise that pile of leaves then. We've got a lot to do before the celebration tomorrow. Nearby, Mrs. Hernandez and her kids were scrubbing the stairwell, their laughter echoing through the building. Mr. Carter, Mrs. Carter's husband, was fixing a broken railing on the second floor with a toolbox he hadn't used in years. Even Miriam, still recovering, had joined in, sitting on a folding chair in the courtyard as she sorted through donated decorations. She waved at Layla, holding up a string of colorful paper lanterns. As the day wore on, the building began to transform. Broken windows were patched with plastic for now, though Mr. Carter promised to replace the glass soon. Faded walls were washed clean, and cheerful decorations appeared in every hallway. Balloons, handmade signs, and strings of lights that twinkled in the dimming evening. Pastor Miller arrived just as the sun began to set, carrying a basket filled with supplies. "This place is looking better already," he said warmly, nodding at Layla. By sunset, the courtyard was transformed into a festive haven. Strings of lights crisscrossed above, casting a warm glow over the tables laden with food. The scent of baked goods and homemade stews filled the air, mingling with the sounds of cheerful conversation. Layla stood near the entrance, welcoming neighbors as they arrived. Pastor Miller walked through the crowd, greeting everyone with his usual kind smile. Even Tyrone had dressed up a bit, though he still found time to tease Layla about her bossy leadership. As the gathering reached its peak, Pastor Miller tapped a spoon against a glass to get everyone's attention. The crowd quieted, turning toward him as he stood near the center of the courtyard. "Tonight," he began, his voice carrying warmth and gratitude, "we're here to celebrate more than just a building. We're here to celebrate what happens when people come together, when neighbors become family, and hope becomes action." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, the energy contagious. Layla glanced around, her chest swelling with pride. For the first time in a long time, she felt like they weren't just surviving, they were thriving. As the celebration continued, Layla found herself scanning the crowd, hoping for a familiar face. But Elliot wasn't there. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching, somewhere, proud of what they had accomplished. As the celebration began to wind down, the courtyard slowly quieted. Families gathered their belongings, children yawned as they clung to their parents, and the once bustling space grew serene under the soft glow of the lights. Layla watched as her neighbors departed, their faces glowing with joy and hope. Yet a part of her felt unsettled. Something unfinished tugged at her heart. She slipped away toward the church. The cool night air wrapped around her as she entered the quiet sanctuary. The dim lighting and flickering candles cast long shadows on the walls, and the familiar warmth of the space eased her nerves. She knelt at one of the pews, clasping her hands tightly as she whispered a prayer. "Dear God, wherever Elliot may be, let him feel the love and gratitude we hold for him. Remind him that his kindness has touched lives and that he's never truly alone." Her voice faltered as emotion swelled in her chest. The silence that followed felt heavy, yet comforting, and she bowed her head, allowing the stillness to settle her racing thoughts. "Didn't I tell you I always keep my promises?" The deep, familiar voice startled her. Layla spun around, her breath catching as she saw Elliot standing near the back of the church. His tattered coat hung loosely over his frame, but his eyes, those piercing blue eyes, held the same steady warmth she remembered. "Elliot!" she exclaimed, rising quickly to her feet. He stepped forward, his movements deliberate but hesitant, as if unsure of his welcome. "I heard there was a celebration," he said, his lips curving into a faint smile. "Looks like I missed most of it." Layla's initial shock melted into a mixture of joy and relief. "You're here," she said, her voice soft. "Why didn't you come sooner? Everyone's been wondering about you." Elliot hesitated, his gaze drifting to the flickering candles at the altar. "Sometimes it's hard to come back," he admitted, "but I needed to see it for myself. What you've built here. What you've done." Layla's brow furrowed. "What we've done, Elliot. You're as much a part of this as anyone else." He shook his head slightly, a flicker of sadness crossing his face. "No, Layla. This is your victory. Your determination brought these people together. You gave them hope." "Because you showed me how," she said firmly, stepping closer. "You were the one who reminded me what kindness can do. how it can ripple out and change things. You've been helping us from the start. Elliot looked at her, his expression softening. Maybe, he said quietly, but this community you've built, it's more than I could have imagined. You should be proud. Layla felt tears prick at her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. We all are, she said, but it's not the same without you here. Elliot's lips twitched into a faint smile, though his eyes glistened with unspoken emotions. I don't know if I belong here, Layla. Not yet. There are still pieces of my past I need to face, things I need to make right. You always say that, Layla said, her voice trembling. But you belong here, with us, with the people you've helped. This is your home, too. The words hung in the air, and for a moment Elliot said nothing. Then he reached out, placing a hand on Layla's shoulder. You're wise beyond your years, you know that? He said softly. I learned from the best, she replied, smiling through her tears. Elliot chuckled lightly, the sound carrying a note of warmth. I'll think about it, he said after a pause. Maybe it's time I stopped running. Layla nodded, hope sparking in her chest. You're always welcome here, Elliot. Always. As they stood in the quiet sanctuary, the flickering candlelight casting a golden glow, Layla felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in months. Elliot was here, and though his path might still be uncertain, she knew this was a turning point. For him, for her, and for the community they had both worked to save. The weeks following Elliot's return were filled with quiet transformation. True to his word, he didn't disappear again. Instead, he began spending more time in the neighborhood, quietly contributing to the changes Layla and her community had started. Though he kept his past to himself, it became clear to everyone that his heart was fully in the present. One crisp afternoon, the courtyard buzzed with activity once more. The renovations had been completed, the broken windows replaced, the stairwells freshly painted, and the heating finally repaired. The residents gathered to celebrate not just the physical changes, but the spirit of resilience that had brought them all together. At the center of it all was Layla. She moved through the crowd, her smile radiant as she chatted with neighbors and accepted countless hugs of gratitude. Her mother, Miriam, stood nearby, looking healthier and more vibrant than she had in years. As the gathering reached its peak, Pastor Miller stood on a small stage, his hands raised to quiet the crowd. Today, he began, his voice strong and clear, we celebrate more than just a building. We celebrate a community that came together, that refused to give up. Each of you played a part in this, and that is what makes this place a home. The applause was thunderous, echoing off the walls of the now vibrant building. Layla stood beside Pastor Miller, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. But as the clapping died down, she felt a hand on her shoulder. Turning, she saw Elliot standing behind her, his face calm but his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite name. Pride, perhaps, or peace. Go on, he said softly, nodding toward the microphone. Layla hesitated, then stepped forward, her small hands gripping the edges of the wooden podium. She took a deep breath, her gaze sweeping over the crowd of familiar faces. I don't have a big speech, she began, her voice steady, but I just want to say thank you to all of you for believing in this, for believing in each other. This building isn't just a place to live, it's a place where we've all found hope, and that's something we'll always share. The crowd cheered again, their voices ringing with joy. Layla stepped back, her cheeks flushed, as Pastor Miller led a prayer to close the ceremony. As the crowd began to disperse, Layla found herself standing alone with Elliot near the edge of the courtyard. She turned to him, her expression serious. You know, you've done a lot more than you give yourself credit for. Elliot chuckled lightly, his hands slipping into his coat pockets. I just gave a little push. The rest was all you. Layla shook her head. No, it wasn't just me. You taught me that kindness matters, that it can change everything. For a moment, Elliot said nothing. Then he knelt slightly, meeting her gaze. And you reminded me that it's never too late to start over, he said quietly. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching as the families returned to their homes, the building now filled with laughter and light. Finally, Elliot spoke again. I think I'm ready, he said, his voice low but steady. Ready for what? Layla asked. To stop running, he replied. To stay, if you'll have me. Layla's face broke into a wide smile. We've always had a place for you, Elliot. You're family now. The words hung in the air, carrying a weight that felt both profound and freeing. Elliot nodded, his expression softening. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the courtyard in a golden glow, Layla felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Certainty. The journey they had all taken, filled with struggle, loss, and perseverance, had brought them here, to this moment of peace. The neighborhood wasn't just surviving anymore, it was thriving, and so were they. Now we've reached the end of this heartwarming journey, a story of sacrifice, compassion, and the strength of community. Layla, Elliot, and their neighbors have shown us that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can create the greatest impact. What do you think about Elliot's decision to stay and become part of the community? Do you believe life's challenges can help us discover the true meaning of family and love? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more inspiring stories like this one. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.